Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Eric Redmond. Eric is a technology evangelist. He's always trying to figure out what technologies are going to be the ones that are going to be part of our main day-to-day life. He has written many books on technology. He has advised government, national and state, and Fortune 100 companies on the upcoming technologies. And his latest book is Deep Tech, Demystifying the Breakthrough Technologies that will revolutionize everything. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, appreciate you having me. Thanks.
So as an investor, Eric, I see your book as a gold mine. I mean, it's not going to tell me exactly which stock to buy tomorrow, but at least it's like a compass on where should I be looking at, because I mean, the investing world is so huge, and just to have a sense of direction helps me out a lot. I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your background. How is it, what did you study? How is it that you became so interested in technology?
Yeah. We only have a few minutes, and my background could probably take hours in itself. The short version is that I was very lucky to get introduced to technology at a pretty young age, and from there, just realized this is what I want to do with my life. Um, Jokingly, a friend of mine started calling me the Forrest Gump of technology. I don't know if you remember the movie, but I just always happened to be very adjacent to a lot of these shifts before they happen. I was involved in the web in the early 90s and had a business while I was still in school, making websites for people. I was involved in the open source movement in the early days, Agile in the early days. Kind of went on from there, did a handful of startups, was in part of the big data revolution, part of the DevOps revolution, and Google Glass, which was sort of augmented reality. I was involved in that. I actually wrote a couple books about Glass. Had some of the first apps out there. Had some of the first apps in the iPhone store, on the Apple Store. My very first app had 2 million downloads. And it's not because it was a great app. It was just there was nothing else out there to download. Right. So everybody grabbed it. Just on and on and on. And so I've always been adjacent to a lot of these revolutions. I just happened to be lucky enough that that's my job now, is to investigate emerging technologies and help steer companies and investors in what's happening next.
Okay, I believe, just like you, that the future is in technology. And many of my listeners also have the same belief. I wonder, how can we to become the Forrest Gump of technology? How can we have our antennas and try to decipher what is something that could work out and what is something that is just, I don't know, woo-woo technology?
Yeah, I would say the best thing to do is don't listen to the hype. Hype tends to happen on a technology that's new because it's exciting and it captures the imagination. But there is a whole lot of it takes a lot to sort of move the world in one direction or another. You've got operationalization. You've got just people being comfortable with the technology. The early adopters, I think the popular press tends to write about things like NFTs. NFTs are great, but they're built on like a decade's worth of technology. And so usually what I say is the best time to hop on a tech is if you're familiar with Gartner's hype cycle. The hype cycle is sort of this curve where it's like, as a new technology or capability is uncovered, and it starts getting written about, and people have ideas about, oh, this is going to be amazing, it's going to change everything. The hype just reaches the fever pitch, and then at its peak, it falls, and it falls because people realize that, oh, all of these amazing promises didn't actually happen. And this falls into what they call the trough of disillusionment. I love this word, this term, because yeah, it didn't hit all those promises immediately. This is when the real work starts. This is when the true believers are still there and they work silently in the background, and they're the ones working on this tech and they're the ones bringing it to life. And it starts going up what's called the slope of enlightenment, where people start realizing over time that, oh, okay, the bugs are getting worked out, it's getting institutionalized. There could be legal challenges that are being um, uh, overcome. Investors start taking notice, and this to me is really like, this is the world of what we call deep tech.
Right.
And deep tech is, it's out of the R&D stage, it's kind of on the other side of the big hype, but now is the time to get in, because you're now a couple years away. There's like this window where it starts to hit the mass market. My favorite example of this is autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles, 3-4 years ago, everybody's like, oh yeah, they're like next year, they're coming out. Everybody's super excited about it. Who's talking about AVs right now? Almost nobody. And now's the time to get in.
Wow. Okay. And how will we separate that from, let's say, a Google Glass that, all the technology is there. There is a big bank backing by multi-billion-dollar corporation, and there is huge media blitz, and then it pans out. Is it maybe that it will take off a few years from today? Who knows?
Yeah, and this is really why I wrote the book. Is you definitely should understand the landscape and understand not just the opportunities, which is what I think drives a lot of that hype, but also those challenges. And so actually that's the structure of the book. Is, we'll delve into a technology like AI, like extended reality, VR, AR, like Internet of Things, and say, look, here's all the promise. It's very exciting. Here's how the technology works, but then ends the chapter with, here's actually all the problems. Here's the unsolved, not just the problems, but also the opportunities. The thing is, because every problem, it can be a niche for someone to come in and solve. And so there's an opportunity there. And getting a sense of what those challenges are, as those challenges get solved, it starts being ready for prime time.
Okay, well, okay, so your book is composed of 7 chapters, and one of them is artificial intelligence, extended reality, blockchain. Um, let's start with artificial reality, no, artificial intelligence, I'm sorry. Where are we? It seems like there is a lot of pros and cons. There are a lot of ethical problems there as well, but it's running our life in many fields. I mean, and we don't think of it, like, for example, Netflix or what is it, the music app, Spotify. This all run by artificial intelligence, but at the same time, people is also, what is it, has racial discrimination embedded in it, because of course is well, I'll let you speak.
Sure, yeah, and AI is a great example of the maxim that technology is not good or evil, it just makes everything more powerful. And the fact is, if there's systemic bias in your system, if there's bias in your data set, AI will learn that bias and exacerbate it. So, in the US, for example, there's this sort of historical concept of redlining, where certain districts were not available for people of color to move into for all sorts of reasons, whether it's legal or just financial. And the issue is that sort of, and that was, in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And then it's like, maybe the particular laws that made redlining legal are repealed, but the effects of that echo throughout history and down through generations. And so an example of that could be credit scores, right? So it's like, maybe you've got a bad credit score because your parents had a bad credit score, because you're in a bad neighborhood, and you're in a bad neighborhood because of redlining. And so these sort of go through history. So the idea then of saying, well, I'm going to take an AI and I'm going to train it against that historical, against that modern data set of credit scores. If there's bias in that credit score, then there's going to be bias in the AI. And I think what's interesting is there's this assumption that because it's a machine, because it's just computer code, that it's unbiased by itself, because it can't, it doesn't have feelings, it doesn't have emotions, it's not, it can't possibly be racist. Well, it can if it's trained in that way. I mean, a really good example of this, I think, is a couple of years ago, Microsoft ended up creating this Twitter bot that went out, and they put it on the net, and it just started reacting to the conversations people were having with the bot on Twitter. And in 24 hours, it just became this just terrible machine of just like, it was racist and it was misogynist and it was just saying insane things because that it was learning what it was being taught, and people were just messing with it.
Wow. Okay. Let's talk for a second about blockchain. And I have a confession. So I bought Bitcoin a long time ago when it was $500. And I just wanted to buy it just to learn because when I bought it, I didn't understand what is it that people were talking about, what was the excitement about. And I bought it and I said, wow, the transaction fees is huge. It's awkward. People don't accept it in the stores. It's too volatile. Anyway, I sold it. I sold it at a nice profit. I bought it at 500. I sold it at 600. Now it's at $50,000. So, but I still don't understand it. I wonder, and I don't know if you understand it as well. You are an early investor, but I really don't know if you understand it as well. So, can you tell us a little bit about the blockchain and Bitcoin, and where is it going? I mean, it cannot continue going exponentially higher because it's it's just impossible.
Well, I think you bring up a point that has two interesting aspects. One is that nobody knows the future. I mean, I bought a cup of coffee in 2013 with half a Bitcoin in Beijing, and that half a Bitcoin is worth $30,000. That was a very expensive cup of coffee. It wasn't that good. And it wasn't that good. It wasn't that memorable. But then at the same time, outside of Bitcoin, I used to have a bunch of Tesla stock, and I sold it at $55 a share, and I bought it at the IPO at 17. So I thought, hey, I did great. I 3x my money. I held on to it a couple of years, and you just never know. I mean, this is just that's the thing. You got to obviously be comfortable with risk if you want to get into any kind of investing, technology or not. And so what I always say is invest in things you believe in. And I think a lot of the folks, I have a buddy he's been hodling for years. And even when he had a ton of Bitcoin, and when it went up to 20,000 in 2017, I was like, why didn't you sell? And he's like, because I think it'll go higher. Like, he just believes in it. Right. And that's the thing. If you're comfortable, you might be right. And, it turns out that history has shown he is right, even though I think he was a sucker. And I was like, I still think he should have sold it. But he didn't. And he's got the last laugh. But maybe not, it could still drop tomorrow. What I think is more interesting is the blockchain technology. What does it enable? And so I think this is where it's really helpful to understand the technology. And again, not ignore the hype. Like, who cares what Bitcoin is right now? I think more interestingly, and also NFTs, whatever, like you got to ask, what can it enable? Like, what is the future likely to be? And this is my prediction in that, is that we're living a world that's increasingly digitized. I always say, it's like, if you want to look at what's going to be the next big thing, just what are your kids doing? Like, what are teenagers doing? Because for them, there is no divide between their physical life and their digital life. None at all. This idea of sort of having separate spheres is very much, we are probably the last, you and I, I'm assuming we're around the same age, are probably the last generation that is going to have a clear, like, this is my real physical life and this is my digital persona. They're not going to understand this. And so then you look about, okay, well, what does it mean to live in a world that's where the lines between physical and digital are blurred? People have been calling that the metaverse, right? This idea of blurring physical and digital. Okay, what does it mean to own something in that digital world? Now it's interesting, because it's like, oh, we have a technology for ownership. We have a technology for being able to own assets in the digital world, and they're called NFTs. And so that's where I think is interesting. It's not about the, getting in and cashing out now. It's about how can you be a part of this world that is trending a certain direction, and how can you get in front of that?
Okay. Could you for my audience and a little bit for myself, well, could you define what is the blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, blockchain is just a database technology.
Okay.
That's all it is. What's interesting about it is there are two aspects of blockchain that make it interesting. One is the fact that anybody can take part in the network. And so that's a very valuable thing. Unlike normal databases, the normal database, like, some company might have a database. A credit score actually is a great example. You've got your sort of credit score. They've got their own database. It's very opaque. You don't know what's going on in there. And you have to trust that the agencies have some mechanism for coming up with a number that's meaningful. But as we said, if they have an AI helping make that decision, it's completely opaque. And why do they deserve that trust? The interesting thing about blockchain is anybody can take part of the network, anybody can verify transactions and say, okay, I know that everything's on the up and up, and that there isn't necessarily some big fraud or market manipulation going on. I mean, there's always attempts at it, but the system as a whole is pretty stable and secure because anybody can verify that it is. That's one aspect of it that's interesting. It's called public and trustless. The other part about it that's interesting is, again, it solves the double spend problem, which is something that banks have been trying to solve for years, and so the idea that you've got your currency or your NFT or anything on this blockchain database technology ensures that some transaction can only happen once and that it can't happen multiple times. And that can be verified because it's public. So kind of get the best of both worlds. But other than that, it's just a database, just a ledger.
Okay, so it's a ledger. Here in Canada, if I buy a house, let's say, I have to go to a notary, and the notary gets certifies that this house belongs to me and that I have the right to sell it to this other person. It is my belief with something like the blockchains, the job of notaries is just going to disappear, because I mean, we will have some kind of token that will certify this is my house, and I will just transfer that to the new buyer. So the notary is going to disappear. I wonder if I know you are thinking of new technologies, but I wonder if you think of what technologies are going to disappear. Like my notary is going to be out of a job in 10 years. I don't know. I don't know exactly 10 years or not, but somewhere along the future. And at one time, let's say Amazon with their new website put out of business Sears that used to have a catalog, which itself was a disruptor as well. So have you thought of who is going out of business?
Yeah, it's always hard to pick winners and losers. I mean, again, what I focus on instead when you talk about a particular company is, I mean, a good company can pivot, right? They can always pivot into something new if they have the stomach for it and the leadership that is focused on it, which is why, again, I mean, really the central conceit of my book is that there is no division between a technology company and a non-technology company. There are companies that leverage technology well, and there are companies that don't leverage technology well. And an example is Amazon, right? Like Amazon is not a tech company, to be entirely clear. They're a marketplace, and they're a logistics company. They leverage technology really, really, really well. But they're not a tech company. Yeah, they have a website, but everybody has a website. Like, who doesn't have a website? You look at Google. Google's not a tech company per se. They're the world's largest advertiser. They just leverage technology really, really well to target those ads. Facebook, interestingly, is a media company, much to their disagreements with that label. But they only fight against being labeled a media company because there's regulations that are attached to it. But at the end of the day, they just specialize in personalized media streams. And they're not a technology company. Yeah, you say, okay, well, Microsoft and Apple, yeah, they're tech companies, kind of. I mean, yeah, they are, but they're also getting into spaces that aren't necessarily tech. I mean, Microsoft has one of the world's largest video game company, that's Xbox, and Apple is getting into television, making television series. So what of those are tech? Almost nothing. There's a tech aspect to it, but they're not tech companies per se. And now I just like that's GAFM, right? That's the 5 top market cap companies, right. That 5-10 years ago, you could say, yes, those are definitely unequivocally tech companies. I don't think you can make that claim anymore because they're just either completely in or getting into spaces that have historically not been in tech. And so I feel like at this stage, no matter what you do, I mean, I don't care. You can be a waste management company. You've got to start leveraging tech and leveraging it well. And so if you're talking about companies to short the ones that aren't taking this seriously, short the ones that are not leveraging tech, that aren't being agile, that aren't being innovative.
Do you suggest any particular resource in order for someone who is curious and who has an eye towards investment to be following, like a website, books, other than yours? I mean,
other than my book, I really don't. I always wish I did, and maybe I'll make a newsletter one of these times. I'm just always kind of constantly reading and absorbing. Part of it's just my job, but part of it is the fact that I just have a social network of people that are always feeding me interesting things. So that's what I would say is like, just make diverse friends, make nerd friends and tech friends that are going to feed you like through these interesting tidbits as they come in.
I'm going to be mailing you every week.
Okay,
can you say a few words about autonomous vehicles? How are they going to be changing our life?
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting is autonomous vehicles is probably the chapter I get the most pushback from everybody, and saying, well, why are you picking this? It's not ready yet. And I'm like, well, it's actually closer than I think a lot of people realize. And I'll give an example. In 2020, so every autonomous vehicle company in California has to publicize what are called disengagements. And disengagement is how many miles have been driven by an autonomous vehicle before a human has to put their hand on the wheel, and sort of disengage the robotic driver for a human. In 2020, Waymo was number one with around 30,000, and Cruise was really close, like 29,000 as well. Now it's not a perfect metric because there's a lot of complaints because you can game that number. But for those car companies, the couple that I mentioned and a few others, they're trying to do sort of real world driving, which is, even though they haven't publicized their tests, it's a pretty decent metric. It's the only one we've got. So think about it this way. It was 30,000 last year. The year before that was around 15,000. The year before that was around 7,000. So it's trajectory about doubling every year. The average human driver gets in an accident once every 180,000 miles. So that's where we're trying to hit. Once we hit about 180, 200,000 miles, robots are now as good, if not slightly better than human drivers. So 30,000 to 2021 this year, 60,000, 120,000, 240,000. So we're about 3 years away from just a disengagement measure of having autonomous vehicles that are as good as human drivers. At that point, there's no reason not to have them everywhere. And so it is, I'd say this decade, in a couple of years, I mean, I'd say by 2025, we're really kind of on track for this. Now that having been said, there's autonomous vehicles that don't necessarily need sort of this general purpose space, like airports and campuses are already starting to use these robots. You're starting to see robot chauffeurs. I think I saw a robot delivery for Domino's being piloted. So it's like we're already getting to this point, and a lot of warehouses are increasingly automated as well.
Mining and farming use a lot of autonomous vehicles for their work, everyday work.
Yeah, exactly. And so and you talked about companies that might be having a rough time. Well, people might be having a rough time too. I mean, the number one employer in the US in many states, I think 29 states, is truck driver. So what do you do when all truck driving is completely automated? I mean, there's millions of people. And so then you think about all the sort of secondary things. So I always think about was the primary industry affected, and then what are the secondary industries affected? What are the tertiary industries affected? So primary is going to be the truck drivers and the trucking companies. That's going to be rough for them. Although some of the trucking companies will automate, but I think every time we have a new technology, it's going to be sort of few players are consolidating. They're going to have these big fleets. The secondary ones are going to be things like a Waffle House, right? Think about, you've got truck stops. Like you drive down the highway. Well, if you don't have human truck drivers, what do you need those for? And then you kind of think through tertiary, like, okay, well, who supplies the Waffle House and the truck stop? And so, I mean, if you really get out ahead of this, you can really start seeing not just who are the winners and the losers, but if you're in that industry, you got to start taking this very seriously now, because the floor could drop out at any moment, and you just got to be ready to pivot.
Wow, Eric, this is a super interesting information. We leave the listeners with 4 chapters to read for themselves. They already heard about artificial intelligence, about the blockchain and the autonomous vehicle. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the name of your book and where can people follow you?
Sure. Yeah, it's Deep Tech. It's available wherever fine books are sold, but probably Amazon is going to be the easiest to get. I'm mostly on LinkedIn.
And you have a website too.
Oh, I do have a website. Yeah, it's deeptechbook.com.
Eric, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.